So that's your temperate deciduous forest. Let's move on further towards the equator. Let's see what we have. Yeah. Now the other point I wanted to discuss with you was the same slide. It's interesting. What do you find here? There is this vast swathe of land. So what is going to come here? There is this vast swathe of land. What is going to come here? Yeah. What is going to come here? So any idea? So any idea what is coming in A and what is coming in B? Maybe what is coming in C? Grassland, desert. In fact, both are the right answer. A is desert. It's your great sandy desert, Australia. B, a large part of B is your grassland. Yeah, the steppes, grassland. But there is also a desert. In this place of C, once again, you have prairies. You have heard of prairies, the grassland of Northern America, but that's in the central. If you come a little toward this side, you have some desert area. Yeah, so both the answers are correct. The interior ones are either grassland or they are desert. Let's see how they are distributed now. The next biome is grassland. So grassland, we are broadly classifying them as temperate grassland and tropical grassland. So needless to say, temperate means the ones which are in the temperate region. Tropical is one which is the tropical region. So let's first look at the temperate grassland. So you have a grassland here. Here you have some grassland being shown as here, some shown as here. So this is your temperate grassland. What this picture also is not showing, by the way, is there is a grassland, temperate grassland this side also. Okay, there's a temperate grassland here also. Now, when I say temperate grassland, what is the picture that you have of a temperate grassland? You will say, what is question? This is, it will be grass. I agree, but anything more than grass in temperate grassland? Zebra, okay. Yeah, so you'll have a lot of grazing animals. Sure, that's correct, Vaibhav. You will have the zebra, and what is going to be the occupation of people in that region? Temperate grassland. Yeah, ranching, animal farming, pastoral communities, all of it. Okay, ranching is more appropriate in the case where you have people who own hundreds of acres of land. Yeah. For example, Texas, a lot of people in Texas. That's why you call them as Texas cowboys. You've heard of the phrase. Okay, so let's look at, yeah, nomadic pastoralists is also there. So you have both extremes. One pastoralist who also depend on grassland, but some more developed guys who have hundreds of acres of land who practice ranching. Okay, so let's look at temperate grassland. So temperate grassland picture is something like this. You know, the look of it itself, you feel, wow, it looks like a nice weather. Yeah, and the grassland, the grass, once again, there's a lot of subdivisions in them. Grasses which grow for 10 centimeter, 20 centimeter, all the way up to grasses which can grow up to 2 meters high. Okay, and being temperate, the winters are cold, but the summers are warm, and there is a reasonable amount of rain as well. There is a reasonable amount of rain. Now, how about the biodiversity? Now, especially if you compare them with, let's say, a temperate deciduous forest. Okay, if you compare the biodiversity of a grassland with a temperate deciduous forest, what do you think is going to happen to the biodiversity? Will it be less, comparable, or more? Biodiversity is going to be more. Okay, anyone for less? Maybe comparable or less. Okay. So there is an interesting phenomena that happens here. When I say temperate deciduous forest, it is temperate for sure. It is cold also. But because it is trees and it also has some amount of grass, and temperate deciduous also has water bodies a little bit. For example, Great Lakes, for example. Yeah, water bodies. The biodiversity will be mammals. It could be avian, bird species. it could be aquatic. Now, because you have different types of ecosystems in temperate deciduous, even though it is cold, but not that cold, no, because that's why human beings are able to live. So you have aquatic ecosystem, you have forest ecosystem, you have trees, therefore you have birds. So you have the the, the in the different kinds of ecosystem increases the species. Whereas in grassland, what is it? Only those species which can survive in grass. For example, it is unlikely I'll find any species of monkeys in grassland. It's unlikely I'll find a lot of nesting birds in grassland, temperate grassland. I'll come to tropical. It's unlikely I'll find a lot of nesting birds in grassland. It is unlikely I'll find a lot of amphibians in grassland. So do you agree? So to that extent, the biodiversity is less, but the abundance is more. So if I were to see the number of grazing animals, it's filled with grazing animals. If I have to see the number of, let's say, things like a grasshopper or a butterfly or a dragonfly, something which can manage with grasses and shrubs, their numbers are very high, but overall the biodiversity is less. Okay, so that's the point about temperate grassland. But the soil is rich in nutrients, and therefore cattle rearing becomes a very important part of the people's occupation here. So, what are the various names given to them? You may have heard of it, but let's just go through it once. Prairies in America. We call this, yeah. So you have here, you have prairies in this place. Pampas, South America. Veld, South Africa. Downs in Australia, and steppes in Central Asia, and maybe some parts of Europe also. Yeah, so this is the various names given to the grassland. In many of these, and I think the last line is somewhat true for all biomes actually. But grasslands, large tracts of grasslands have very easily been converted into agricultural lands because of expansion of human population, towards them. Yeah? So this has been a recurrent theme all through. It is definitely there for temperate grasslands as well. Okay. Now someone tell me the same picture of temperate grassland. How will the picture change in case of a tropical grassland? Any idea? Temperate grasslands picture, how is it going to change in case of a tropical grassland? Because what is going to be same is once again grass, but what is going to be different? More trees, okay. Any other point? More trees, I'll come to that. It's a special type of tropical grassland called as the savannas. So when you move from temperate to tropic, what is increasing? The temperature is increasing. So when the temperature is increasing, what is going to happen? More biodiversity, probably. Because especially if you have savanna type of a thing, you will have more biodiversity. But the simple thing that's going to happen is, yeah, one reduced height of grass, and temperate grassland, tropical grasslands are the ones which are going to be drier. They're going to be drier. Rains is there, but rains is not a major factor. Means if you compare the rains of temperate grassland and the tropical grassland, rains is not a factor which is very different. It is comparable. Tropical grassland may receive slightly better rainfall, but the heat is also very high. Yeah. So your tropical grassland picture would be something like this. You can see it's a little dry, but in the background you do see some trees. So to that extent, what you guys said about biodiversity is true, because you have more biodiversity, species that jump on the trees to some of the other wild animals. Yeah. Now, interesting thing, I wanted to connect to this Asiatic cheetah translocation to MP's Puno National Park. Yeah. So this is a typical habitat of a lion or a tiger or one of those families. Yeah. Can you now imagine why grasslands are there? Because that is their natural habitat. So it is not very difficult to find a place. So this is some wildlife sanctuary or a national park in Africa, but you can pretty much find a similar landscape in India also. Yeah, that is why they are trying to translocate the cheetah from Africa to India. Okay, so let's look at it. What are the various key features? Biomes that are dominated by grass and shrubs. It could be anywhere from semi-arid to semi-humid. So the rainfall itself varies. And that type of grassland which has scattered trees in them, it's called as the savanna. Yeah. And rainfall is not great. As you can see here, rainfall is not great. 20 to 50 inches, or let me put it as 50 centimeters to 130 centimeters. 50 centimeters is relatively small. 50 centimeters is nothing. Means there are some states which receive 50 centimeter in 2 weeks. Yeah, during monsoon, Goa may receive 50 centimeters in 2 weeks or 3 weeks. Okay. Now, let us look at the location of these tropical grassland and temperate grassland once again. Temperate grassland is clear. Let's look at tropical grassland. The tropical grassland is this. Okay. What is this region, guys, which is not left? This one, according to you, of Africa. Because answering that will help you to understand the spread, the rainfall pattern, everything related to tropical grassland. Excellent. That's the right answer. Rainforest parts. You're absolutely right. So here you have the equator. Let's say the equator passes through like this. Yeah, you have the equator here. So just above and below the equator, you have the what do you have? You have the rainforest. So rainforest means highest rainfall. Let's say as high as 400 centimeters of rainfall. Okay. Then as you move a little up, the diversity of rainforest comes down. You'll have some trees, but you also have a lot of grass. You have a lot of grass. And this whole area, which is to the north of the equator, in the sense which is to the north of the rainforest, and which is to the south of rainforest, here all the way here. This is your tropical grassland, and to the north of tropical grassland is your desert. You have your Sahara here, you have your Kalahari, and your Namib desert here. So the beauty of Africa as a continent, if you look at it, it is somewhat symmetrical. Equator, above and below rainforest. Above and below the rainforest, tropical grassland. Above and below the tropical grassland, desert. Okay, which means as I move from this end to this end, what can I see? I can say that the rainfall is going to decrease. Similarly, as I move from south of equator also, I can say that rainfall will decrease. So are you able to see the symmetry that I'm talking about? It looks as if, and this is especially true for Africa, guys. It is especially true for Africa. Okay. Now look at the beauty in the case of South America also. To some extent, it is true for South America also. This around equator, a large part here is your rainforest. Yeah. Below this, what have we shown? We have shown as the tropical grassland. Yeah. Then you have the temperate grassland. And below that, what do you have? You have the cold desert. So somewhere, at least in these two continents, it looks to me that there is rainforest followed by tropical grassland. There is no temperate grassland in Africa, but there is temperate grassland in South America. So somewhere you can say that the grasslands are sandwiched between desert on one end, between desert and rainforest. This you can very comfortably say in the case of Africa. Yeah, the case of Africa. Now, similarly, if you look at America, for example, you had this entire region. This was what? Temperate deciduous forest. Yeah, then you have temperate grassland. Then somewhat in this region and this region, where there is gap, no? Here you have desert. In the case of Australia. Similarly, take up the case of America. Take up the case of Australia. So you have tropical grassland, you have temperate grassland, and here in between here we agreed that all the major cities of Australia are here, which is your temperate deciduous forest. This large area is a desert. Yeah. So I want you to just understand the pattern in which a biome is distributed, so that it becomes a little easier for you to understand. If at all, there is something asked relating biomes to the geographical position. Okay, I think we're done with the grasslands. Tropical rainforest. Tropical rainforest. So in this, while we are talking of tropical rainforest, a special type or more intense tropical rainforest is called as equatorial rainforest. Equatorial rainforest. So let's look at the features one by one. Kind of self-explanatory. We can go fast. No dry season. All months have an average precipitation. So it is there all through the year. All through the year there is rain. Yeah, anyone who's been in Singapore or Malaysia will tell you that it almost rains daily, but it rains very limitedly, but almost daily. Okay? So there is no dry season. True rainforests are between 10 degrees north and south of equator. Yeah, so what they mean by true rainforest is equatorial rainforest. Now, a very interesting thing is the soil quality. The general impression is, oh, if there is going to be a tropical rainforest, it means that the soil quality has to be very good. No? Only if the soil quality is very good can it really support a lot of trees. But the truth is slightly different. The trees are able to support themselves not because of poor quality, not because of good quality of soil, but despite poor quality of soil. Now, why poor quality of soil is, it rains how much? Anywhere between 200 to 400 centimeters annually. Which means it is constantly pouring. And it takes away the surface runoff, takes away the nutrients along with it. Then we may say, but then how is it possible that the trees grew in the first place? That is not because of high quality of soil, but that is because of some of the trees themselves, which have very deep roots or very widespread roots. So they're able to get hold of nutrients and water because of their own adaptation, so to say. Yeah, one thing I want you to remember is the quality of soil in the case of rainforest is not great, it is actually poor. Biodiversity, we all know, extremely high biodiversity. 40 to 75% of all biotic species. 40 to 75%. Yeah, it's a broad estimate. And scientists believe that many of the species we have not even discovered them. We have not even discovered them. It's also called as the world's largest pharmacy. Once again, not very difficult to imagine. Over 1/4 of the natural medicine have been discovered from the tropical rainforest. Now, the other part is, if you look at the tropical rainforest, one very interesting aspect is, if you are in the middle of a tropical rainforest, okay, let's say at maybe 11 a.m. in the morning, there will be several stretches of the tropical rainforest where you will need something like a torchlight to be able to navigate that part, because the canopy density is so high that sometimes only 2% of the sunlight is able to touch the floor. 2% of the sunlight, imagine. This is almost like complete darkness. Yeah. Now, why is that 2%? Because the canopy is thick. You can, this is a somewhat top view of the rainforest. If you can see here, are you able to see how thick the canopy is from the top? Yeah, so it's a thick canopy. Therefore, very little sunlight passes through. Okay, very little sunlight passes through. Which means, and here comes another interesting part, it is rather very rare that you find shrubs of, let's say, 2, 3, 5 meters tall. Why? Because that much sunlight does not pass at all. Which means, if you are in a true tropical rainforest or true equatorial rainforest, you have very tall trees which are competing with each other for sunlight. And at the base, you have nothing. Is that clear? So either it is very tall trees of different species, but you don't have a lot of shrubs or herbs which could, typically where you find, you don't have something like a grassland. You don't find grasses there. You don't find shrubs which are 1 meters, 2 meters. But what you can find is the equivalent of creepers. Means the plant by itself cannot grow, so it tries to grow on top of these trees, and that's how that is once again an adaptation. It is able to do it so that it is able to get a share of sunlight which it would otherwise never get if it were to be lying only at the ground level. Okay, so this point is about low penetration. Yeah. Now, why we said that the soil quality is poor? Yeah, that much we said because of excessive leaching. Now, but at the same time, the organic matter is constantly there in the soil. So what happens is the leaves are shedding. It is hot and humid, so they decompose quickly. There is a good amount of organic content, but it also rains and it takes away the organic content. So are you able to understand it that way? Yeah. So if they say the soil has or the floor, forest floor has a continuous organic content of decaying plant and animal, the answer is yes. But if there is an option which says the soil quality is too poor because of excessive leaching, that is also true. So both seemingly contradictory thing happens in a rainforest. I want you to remember this. Okay. So that's a tropical rainforest. The last biome is desert. Okay. Now we said that we will start from the pole and we will come to the equator. Okay. So now tell me which is a proper equator. Desert is near the equator or the rainforest is near the equator, between these two? Or where do desert usually occur? Which one is closer to the equator typically? The tropical rainforest or desert? Rainforest? Rainforest is closer. Okay, all of you are saying rainforest is closer. Good. Yeah. Now that is somewhat a peculiar thing because what did we say? The more we are closer to the equator, there is a greater mean average temperature, but desert is an exception. So desert is an exception because one, it is hot. Two, it is also devoid of moisture content, and the average annual rainfall is very low. We'll see how low it is, but it is very low. Now let's first look at the geographical spread of the arid and semi-arid regions. So the other technical name for desert is arid and semi-arid. So let's look at how geographically they are distributed. Yeah. So this we all know, the Sahara Desert. The Sahara, what they're showing is extremely arid. Extremely arid. Then comes arid and semi-arid. And then you have the Arabian Desert, which is also extremely arid. Then you have region around this Gobi Desert, extremely arid. There is a small place around this part, Atacama Desert, which is also extremely arid. Yeah. So these are the ones which are really arid. Maybe a small one here also, the Namib Desert. Yeah, the ones which are shown in deep red color. These are extremely arid. In addition to it, there are a lot of other deserts, as you have seen. I don't know how we pronounce it in Spanish. Let me say Mojave, Sonoran Desert. So these two are also desert. Now, so whenever we say desert, no, in India at least, in India, this is the image we remember of desert. Am I right? This is the image. Now, do all desert have to be like this? Answer is no. Yeah. When you get time, just type an image of this Mojave Desert. Yeah, it is part of the it's part of the Grand Canyon. Must have heard of Grand Canyon. Yeah. So it is part of the Grand Canyon. This type of hot desert is there primarily in Thar and Arabian Desert. Sahara also to a good extent, yeah, but not necessarily in places like your Mojave Desert, or even in many places of in Australia also. Australia also has various type of desert. So this is typically a sand dune. But a desert can also be like this, extremely cold. This shows some kind of vegetation, but these are all, as you can see, plants that have adapted themselves to the desert condition. Yeah, cactus-like plants. That's your broad overview of deserts spread all over the world. Now, in this, if you look at it, primarily the deserts are one characteristic feature that you can find for the major desert area is that they are somewhat in the continental interiors. Sahara Desert, Gobi, Mojave is not the center, but it is definitely to the leeway side of Rocky Mountains. You understand leeway side? The one which is not facing the ocean side. So Mojave Desert. Patagonia is coastal. But there are some deserts which are coastal. For example, Namib Desert is coastal. Atacama Desert is coastal. Okay. Now, one of the reasons why, see, if a desert is in the interior of a continent, you can understand. What you can understand, you can very easily understand that before the moisture-laden winds comes to them, they have lost all the moisture. As simple as that. That is an understandable thing. But how do you explain deserts which are on the coast? For example, an Atacama Desert and a Namib Desert. How do you explain deserts which are at the coast? Aren't they supposed not to be desert? Because if the moisture-laden winds come, they must be dropping off their moisture at that place. Any idea why do you think they are deserts there? Excellent, guys. The answer is right. Cold currents. Yeah. Please do find what those currents are. I'm forgetting for Atacama, but here in Namib Desert, you have this cold current called Benguela. Yeah. Does anyone remember the cold current here by any chance, Bhavna or any one of you? There is a cold current that flows in this direction, which is a cause of Atacama Desert being a desert. And by the way, just for your information, Atacama also has the distinction of being the world's Humboldt. Is it okay? Possible, Arun, I'm not sure. Atacama has the distinction of being the world's driest place. Driest place means annually it gets 1.5 centimeters of rainfall. Very, very low even by desert standards. So the driest place on earth is neither Sahara nor any of these big deserts like Arabian, but it is paradoxically an area very close to the seashore. Right? So it's very interesting. Atacama. So Atacama is in which country would you put that? Atacama. Which country? Peru. Peru border with. Yeah. So Atacama, it may be spreading to Peru, but it is traditionally associated with Chile. Yeah, it is traditionally associated with Chile. Some part may be going to Atacama, but the one that I'm talking about, the driest place on earth, it belongs to Chile. Okay. Any reason why Chile was in news recently? I don't know if it was Chile. Yeah, I think it was Chile. Any reason why Chile was in news recently? Very good, Arun. Yes, a young new president who's only 35 years old. Yeah, students leader, absolutely. He's only 35 years old, guys. Boric, Boric is his name. So that's why Chile was in news. So Chile, if you see, the interesting thing about Chile is that it has a tradition of electing the left-wing leaders who come from very, very humble background. The current head of United Nations Human Rights Commission. Sorry, I'm forgetting her name. If you Google it, you'll get her name. Current president of United Nations Human Rights Commission. She is a former Chile president. So she was a very inspiring figure. No, it's a typical Spanish name. Chile. Is it Najat? 1 second, or am I giving you the wrong? Sorry, I'm giving you the wrong. Just give me a second. 1 second. Let me just check it myself. That, because she's quite vocal about. Oh, so you are right, Sagarika. It's just that I have given the wrong clue. 1 minute. Human Rights Commission or High Commissioner for Refugees. High Commissioner for Refugees. 1 second. Ah, yes, this was her name, Michelle Blanchett. But how did I say that she's related to UN? Ah, yeah, here you go. Oh, it's yeah, High Commissioner for Human Rights. Okay, maybe I somewhere mistook this position to be the head of Human Rights Commission, Sagarika. So technically, what the name that you have said is correct. It's just that I have given the wrong. Anyway, no problem. So this Michelle Blanchett, when you get time, just read some of her biography. Very moving and powerful. She lost her husband, father, brothers to a Chilean dictator. All of them were arrested and they could never be found where they were. So Chile is one country where all these kinds of forced disappearances happen. Chile, Argentina, Peru, all of them are well known for that. Okay. Okay, great. That brings us, okay, so we've not studied this desert part. So let's anyway go through, we all know it, but let's go through, sometimes new things may come. Barren island, this is fine. Yeah, this is important. The lack of vegetation exposes the unprotected surface to the process of denudation, wearing away of rocks. Now, because there is no vegetation, yeah, imagine a rock. Yeah, imagine a rock, and it is directly under the influence of sun. Am I right? Directly under the influence of sun. So let's say few weeks or months or years back, some rain had fallen. So the rain droplets had entered into the interstices. You understand interstices? The holes within the rock. It has entered within the holes of the rock. Now, because of heat, and heat is quite intense, let's say 45 degrees. So it will touch the stone and it will heat the stone. Now, what happens to this water that has got into the gap? It will expand. Do you agree? There are multiple water vapors which will expand. Now, when it expands, what does it do? It adds stress to the rock. It adds stress to the rock. Then during night time, because it is a desert, if you remember, I think in one of our first classes, we talked about why when you don't have a cloud, the variation of temperature in the same day will be very high. Okay. So the rock will expand. I'm sorry, the water droplet will expand, exerting stress on the rock. Then during night time, sorry. So during night time, what happens? Let's say the temperature dips to 5 degrees. Yeah, 45, 5. Now what happens? Then the water at 4 degrees, water has the highest density, by the way. So it really reduces in size. The next day, new story. Again, the same thing. So expand, contract, expand, contract. What's going to happen to the rock? The rock will easily get weathered. Weathered. Okay. So in a desert, the forces of denudation, like and the agents of erosion, both are very active. Okay, in this case, agent of erosion is wind. So what happened? This rock has broken into 5 pieces. Earlier, this rock could not be carried away by the wind, but now because it has broken into 5 pieces, these pieces can be carried by the wind. So as the wind carries it, what happens? The rock also kind of rotates, and there is wear and tear, and slowly the rock becomes a soil. Okay. So what is the root cause for all of this? The root cause for all of this is the lack of vegetation. Okay. Now, 1/3 of the land surface is arid and semi-arid. So we just discussed earlier that arid alone is around 20%. Okay, so if you add semi-arid, it comes to 1/3, which is 33% of the land surface is arid and semi-arid. This is actually a cause of concern because when we talk about land degradation, I'll tell you, deserts have a self-propagating capacity. Yeah, remember this word. They have a self-propagating capacity. Means left to itself, they will bring more and more area under desert. We'll see how it happens. Okay. Temperatures exhibit daily extremes. This also we know. Why? Because there is atmosphere contains little humidity. Read little humidity as little cloud cover. So less cloud, direct sunlight, very high temperature during the morning, very low temperature during the evening. Then evaporation rates regularly exceed rainfall rates. Evaporation rates regularly exceed rainfall rates. Sometimes rain starts falling and evaporates before reaching the ground. So this is very tragic. The rain, people have started seeing the cloud, Okay, people have started seeing the cloud and they have not seen rain for a long time. So they start dancing. Yeah, the rain is going to come. They are sure the rain is falling, but they're not, they are seeing that the rain is not touching the ground. Yeah. So that's a little tragic, but that is the nature of the comparative rate of evaporation and precipitation. Okay. Now this thing, no, of people dancing in expectation of rain. Several years ago, maybe 20 years ago, I saw this movie. I don't know how many of you have seen this movie. Have you? I hope that was very quick. Yeah, I saw this movie called Lagan. So the first scene of Lagan starts with a song where people are dancing, thinking that the rain is going to come. But by the way, it is shot in Butch, which anyway is a semi-arid region. So people dance. It almost looks that it's about to fall, but then nothing happens. Yeah. So that is how the movie starts, and then they have nothing to give to the Britishers because the whole thing is about how much of your crops share are you willing to give to the Britishers, and then our hero Amir Khan comes, and the rest is history. Okay. So this point also we discussed 1.5 centimeters, the driest place on earth, Atacama Desert of Chile. The other deserts are all given here. Okay. So we have completed biome. We have completed biome. So which is the easier part. The tougher part, unfortunately, I'm not going to help you. All that I have done is nicely made a table, put the region, and put the flora and fauna. Yeah, this is your self-study. Study as much as you can, or remember as much as you can. Especially if some of them happens to be in the IUCN list, then it becomes all the more important. Okay. Otherwise, have this as a backup, as a backup, and read when you can. Okay. Great. Okay. So now we will discuss some very simple or basic topics related to ecosystem, related to environment. The first topic is about energy flow. Okay, energy flow in an ecosystem or energy flow through the trophic levels. Energy flow from the producer to the consumers. How does this happen? First is the definition of trophic level. I would have used this term so many times. By this time, you would have known it. But in case you exactly want to know what is trophic level, so this is your trophic level. This is your trophic level. So the first TL1 is trophic level 1. So trophic level 1 is usually autotrophs. Why I am saying usually and not always will come. Okay, trophic level 1 is usually autotrophs. So autotrophs are those which is the green plants which can make food by themselves. So you have the sun, which gives the solar energy, then water, carbon monoxide together, they produce food. They add biomass to themselves. When they add biomass to themselves, there are herbivores which feed on them. So herbivores come under trophic level 2, which are, and herbivores are also called as primary consumers. So there are a lot of terms here. I'm sure majority of you know it, but just to be sure, the first level is autotrophs. Auto means automatic, by itself, auto. Hetero is something which is dependent on autotrophs. Okay. The other name for autotrophs is also producers. The other name for heterotrophs is consumers. Producers and consumers. Okay. Then you have herbivore, trophic level 2. Herbivores are consumed by the carnivores, which is usually the wild animal. One that can consume both the carnivore as well as, ones that can consume the herbivore or the plant, sometimes even the carnivore, yeah, is the omnivore. So omnivore example is man. But man is not the only example. There are several examples of omnivore. Even ant is an omnivore. Yeah, the smallest of animal, ant is an omnivore. Okay. So this is the basic principle of trophic level. And what I have just shown to you now is also an example of food chain. Correct? What I've just shown to you is also an example of food chain. Now, this food chain starts with plant and grasses which are eaten by herbivore. Therefore, this type of food chain is called as a grazing food chain because it starts with grazing animals. Is the point clear? First, it's a food chain because one trophic level above another, that is food chain. Why grazing food chain? Because the trophic level 2 that we are talking about is herbivores, which are grazing animals. Is this clear? Now, if you ask me, is this the only type of food chain present? Do you know any other kind of food chain? Any other kind of food chain where it does not start with the plant? It starts with something else. Yeah, excellent. So the fundamental difference, as you can see, in grazing food chain, it is the plant. In detritus food chain, it is decaying plant and animal. Means imagine a food chain starts after something dies. Here the food chain starts when something is alive. So what is a detritus food chain? Yeah, let me first explain this. Detritus food chain is what? Very simple. You have dead plant and animal. Then there are certain species which are called as detrivore. Detrivore means they eat the decaying plant and animal matter. Okay. Now, if you compare this with grazing food chain was, let's say, plant. Then there was herbivore. Then there is, let's say, carnivore. Okay. Now, the interesting thing about this detritus food chain is, unlike your grazing food chain, in which trophic level 1 was an autotroph, here the trophic level 1 is a dead animal or a plant. Yeah. And trophic level 2 was a herbivore. Here, trophic level 2. So, this is the trophic level 2. This is the trophic level 1. This is the trophic level 3. So, here the trophic level 2 was a herbivore. Here is a detrivore. But trophic level 3 onwards, it becomes same. So, that's the difference and that's the similarity. Okay, difference is the first two trophic levels are very different. But after that, it becomes carnivore, omnivore, it's the same. Okay. Now, your so that is the second type of food chain, grazing food chain and detritus food chain. Now, both grazing and detritus food chain are predominantly terrestrial food chain. Detritus can still be somewhat aquatic also, can be aquatic, yes, it's possible, but grazing is predominantly terrestrial. Okay, but if you look at aquatic food chain is what? The equivalent of plant. So now let's draw a parallel. The equivalent of a plant in grazing food chain is phytoplankton. Here it is zooplankton, here it was herbivore. Then here it is carnivore as animal, here it is. So here from here it becomes same. So the interesting thing, what you find between the grazing food chain, the detritus food chain, and the aquatic food chain is the differences, if at all they are there, occurs only in the first two trophic level. There it was plant. In aquatic food chain, it is a phytoplankton. In detritus food chain, it is a dead plant. Once again, trophic level 2, in the grazing food chain, it was a herbivore. In the aquatic food chain, it's a zooplankton. In the detritus food chain, it's a detrivore. But trophic level 3 and above is the same, carnivore and omnivore, as the case may be. Okay, so is this clear, guys? Now, the question that I have for you is, are these food chain watertight compartments? Are these food chain, the three food chain, watertight compartments? Whatever you understand by the term. Yeah, let me not explain the term. Or are these food chain self-contained units? Or are they watertight compartments with no interaction with outside bodies? No? Okay. Anyone for yes? Tiger eats man, okay. So what I'm basically asking is, let me clarify the question. What I'm saying is, do these food chain, okay, I have aquatic, I have detritus, and I have what is the other one? I have the grazing food chain. Okay, is there by any chance interaction between these food chains? This is what I meant. The answer that you are given, no, is the right answer. No is the right answer. Yeah. Why? Because no food chain in reality exists like this. The concept of food chain, the way I have just told you, is a theoretical concept. In practical, it is not. For example, I am saying that bird is part of a detritus food chain. But does anything in the nature stop a bird from eating a small fish or even a large fish? Nothing. Yeah. Does anything stop a man from eating a large fish or a bird or any animal in the grazing food chain? Nothing. This also brings us to the concept of food web. We started with food chain. Yeah. Now we move towards food web. How are we moving from food chain to food web? To understand the intricacies of how the energy moves from one trophic level to another. This is to say that in nature, there isn't only one connection from one trophic level to another. Let's see what this means. Let me take the case of the grass. Yeah. Now the grass, let's say, is eaten by a grasshopper. Possible. The grasshopper, let's say, is eaten by a frog. The frog is eaten by a snake. The snake is eaten by an eagle. Now, what is this? This is an example of food chain. This is an example of food chain. But the grass can also be eaten by a rabbit. Possible? Possible. Now, the rabbit can also be eaten by what? Yeah, someone is giving me an answer. Rabbit can be eaten by, yeah, wolf, let's say. Wolf. Now, this grass can also be eaten by, or let's say, frog here, or let's say snake. So the snake, how do we complete this? Wolf cannot be eaten by a snake. Rabbit, let me say, grass, let me say goat. Okay. Let's say the goat in this case is eaten by a man. Okay. But a man can also eat a rabbit. Depending on which part of the world you are, can also eat this. He may also eat this, I don't know. Yeah. Now, what is this tossing? Yeah, snake can eat a rabbit. You're quite right. You know, especially if it is a python or something, a snake can eat a rabbit. Yeah. So now what is happening? We started off with a very linear concept. Grass, grasshopper, frog, snake, eagle. That's all. That simple approximation of real life phenomena is a food chain. But that is far away from the truth. The truth is each trophic level in a food chain can be connected to more than one trophic level. See here, the beauty in this, the simplicity in this food chain was trophic level 1 is connected only to trophic level 2. Trophic level 2 is only connected to trophic level 3. Same here. Trophic level 1 is connected to only trophic level 2. This is connected only to trophic level 3. This is only connected to trophic level 4. But here, look at this. Trophic. So this was trophic level 1. This is trophic level 2. Let's say 3, 4, 5. Yeah. Let me put man and eagle perhaps on the same one. So let me put this also as 5. Now 5, here 5 is eating 4, but here 5 is eating 2. 5 is eating 2. And 4 is eating 3, but 4 is also eating 2. 5 can eat 4 and 3 also. Okay. So this phenomena where the linear flow of energy is transformed into a web becomes food web. Okay. So I think it's a relatively easy phenomena to understand. Let me not spend too much time on this. So we've got the concept. So in other words, if I were to tell as food chain, versus food web. Food web. The first one, the difference is this is linear. This is web-like. Web-like or complex. Say web-like or complex. Second, this is theoretical. This doesn't exist in nature. Theoretical. This is natural. Here, one trophic level is connected to only one trophic level. Only another means only one trophic level. Here, one trophic level is connected to multiple trophic levels. Okay. Yeah. Now the most important part. I think this point I forgot. How about the stability? Which one do you think is more stable, food chain or food web? Any idea? Food chain or food web? Web is more stable. Absolutely. Food web is more stable. Please note it down. This is less stable. This is less stable. This is more stable. And the reason why is because each trophic level is dependent on another trophic level. In that also a specific species. Here, even if one species dies, some species in a different trophic level is still able to be a predator or a prey, as the case may be. Okay, so food web is more flexible. Okay, great. Yeah, I think this we have just discussed. Okay, so I have mentioned something about phytoplankton. I think we already know about a lot about phytoplankton. Zooplankton, we know. Okay, I think this is something. Yeah, the next concept is on ecological pyramid. It's also a simple concept. Majority of you already know it, but let me discuss it nevertheless. So whenever someone says pyramid, what do you remember? Maybe you remember Egyptians, you remember mummy and all that. I mean, mummy as an Egyptian mummy. So, but what we obviously remember by pyramid is the shape. Am I right? Pyramid, we remember the shape. So, which means there is a broad base, and as I move up, it tapers up. It tapers up. That's what is pyramid. So, when I say pyramid of numbers, what does it mean? In the previous one, this one. Yeah. So what it actually means is the pyramid of number would mean that I have a large number of plants / grasses or any autotroph. Then, so this is number n. Let's say if I have something like n1, then I have herbivore as n2. Then I have carnivore as n3 and omnivore as n4. Then the general understanding is, as per pyramid of numbers, n1 is greater than n2, is greater than n3, is greater than n4. Not very difficult to understand. Yeah, because you need more number of plants so that a relatively lesser number of herbivore can survive. You need good number of herbivores so that carnivore can survive, so on and so on. And naturally, this is tending towards a pyramid. And hence the name pyramid of numbers. Pyramid of numbers. That's the first pyramid. Ecological pyramid the first pyramid is pyramid of numbers. The second pyramid is pyramid of biomass. Pyramid of biomass. So instead of n, if I say m, mass of plants / grass in a normal condition follows the same rule. The mass of trophic level 1 is more than the mass at trophic level 2, is more than the mass at trophic level 3, is more than the mass at trophic level 4. general rule. You will see the exceptions, but this is the general rule. The third one, and here comes the trickier part. Which trophic level do you think has more energy? So let me call it as the same nomenclature. E1, E2, E3, E4. So what symbol should I put? Should I follow the pyramid of numbers and biomass, or the energy may be different? And give your justification either way. Same? Okay. Anyone for a different one? Anyone says no, it's not the same, it's the opposite? Okay, so no one disagrees with Prachi because that's the right answer. So sometimes I make it a little dramatic. It's the same one. Yeah, there is a loss of energy going upwards. You're right, Bhavna, which is the rationale why it's the same. The energy at trophic level 1 is more than energy at trophic level 2, more than energy at trophic level 3, more than energy at trophic level 4. Which means under normal circumstances, what is happening? The number, biomass, energy, 3 pyramids. All 3 pyramids are in the proper pyramid shape. So far, so clear? So this is the normal situation. Now we will come to a situation called inverted pyramids. So the topic that we are going to discuss now is inverted pyramids. Inverted pyramids. Just now I told that numbers at trophic level 1 will generally be more or always be more. Let me give you another case. Let me start with, what should I say? How about a banyan tree? Yeah. So what do I have? I have a banyan tree, but only one banyan tree. Okay. Can a banyan tree host something like a 20 birds and their families? Quite possible. So one banyan tree, 20 birds. What has happened? It has increased. Now imagine each bird has 5 parasites. It's possible. Animals do have parasites. Fleas or anything that sucks their blood. They're parasite. And I say 5. So 20 into 5 is 100. And then there is a funda called as hyperparasite. Hyperparasite is, they're really smart guys. Parasite itself sucks blood or feeds on someone else. Hyperparasite are those special type of microorganisms or very minute organisms which feed on the parasites. So this is called hyperparasite. Hyperparasite. So one banyan tree, 20 birds, 100 parasites, maybe 1,000 hyperparasites. We've just seen how the pyramid of number can be easily inverted. Because it is numbers, no? It is numbers. One banyan tree very big, but the number is still 1. Large number of birds, obviously large number of birds. Yeah. Now in this example, can someone tell me, will the biomass also be inverted in this example? In terms of yes or no, the biomass also inverted, or biomass is the same? What I'm asking is, will the biomass be similar to a normal pyramid, or is the biomass also inverted pyramid? We talked of the numbers here. So in this pyramid, the biomass is normal. Because look at this, no, one banyan tree, I don't know how big it will be, maybe 10 tons, 20 birds, hardly anything, 1 kg, or let's say 10 kgs. Parasites, definitely going to be less, hyperparasites, definitely going to be less. So in this case, even though the number pyramid is inverted, the biomass pyramid is the same. Is this point clear, guys? So now we have seen that a number pyramid can be inverted. So can a biomass pyramid be inverted? Biomass pyramid being inverted happens only in 2 conditions. I want you to make note of it. Biomass inversion can happens, or biomass inversion has 2 characteristics. A, it is generally found in aquatic ecosystems. That's the first point I want you to note. A, it is generally found in aquatic ecosystems. And B, more importantly, it is temporary. It is not permanent. Biomass inversion, whatever people have observed, it is temporary. So let's look at biomass inversion. Let's go to aquatic ecosystem. There is plankton. Okay, there is plankton. Let's say the sun has come after a long time, and because of the sun, there is a sudden growth of plankton. Okay, there is plankton. Now the zooplankton, which is like your jellyfish and some of the smaller zooplanktons like protozoans, they did not exist here. But suddenly, because the food has come, large number of zooplankton have come. Large number. So what has happened is they have almost completely eaten the plankton. Means, let's say they have eaten something like 70% of the plankton. Yeah. So originally the plankton was very high and zooplankton was almost nil or very little. But now a fresh colony of zooplankton has come, and what have they done? They have reduced this. So this one has now become something like this. This is your new plankton population temporarily. But the number of zooplankton that have just eaten the plankton is very high. That's why I said it is temporary. So there was a large number of phytoplankton, but large number of phytoplankton, initially they were very small. So at that time, the biomass pyramid was the normal pyramid. But in an instant, a large number of zooplankton have descended and they have consumed majority of the plankton. So the moment they have consumed the majority of the plankton, where is the plankton? Phytoplankton, the plankton is in their stomachs. Yeah. And in terms of biomass, the biomass of the zooplankton at the instant that they have eaten the phytoplankton, the biomass becomes inverted because there is less phytoplankton and there is slightly higher zooplankton. But this is only temporary. Why? Because this cannot exist, no? Sooner or later, because there is less phytoplankton, the zooplankton will die due to starvation. So they will go elsewhere. And then once again, the phytoplankton size will increase. Okay. So the interesting thing about the inversion of pyramid for biomass is that A, it is generally been observed in aquatic ecosystem, and B, it is temporary in nature. Now let's come to inversion pyramid of energy. Now, inversion pyramid of energy will happen under what circumstances? When can energy pyramid be inverted? Okay. Anyone willing to challenge Prachi on this? Under no circumstances. So that's an absolute statement, Prachi, in UPSC. Yeah. So let's try to understand her argument. Under no circumstances is the energy pyramid inverted. And before we go on to solve this, there is a simple rule for the pyramids. It is called as the 10% rule, or also known as Lendemann's rule. Under 10% rule, it says that only 10% of the energy is transferred from the lower trophic level to higher trophic level. So trophic level 1, then I have trophic level 2, then I have trophic level 3. Suppose this trophic level, go back, grass, means energy stored in the green content of the grass, energy stored in the trees. Suppose if that is 100 calories, when that grass is eaten by all the species in trophic level 2, which could be a combination of grasshoppers, deers, anything else, only 10% of this goes as energy into trophic level 2. And when that is eaten in carnivore, 10% of that is 1 calorie. So this was 100 kcal, this is 10 kcal, and this is 1 kcal. Now, so the first thing why energy pyramid can never be inverted is simply because of Lendemann's rule. only 10% of energy is transferred from a lower trophic level to higher trophic level. Point number one. Okay. Point number two, if you want to further remember it, remember law of conservation of energy. Energy can neither be created nor be destroyed, but it can only be transferred from one form to another. Now, how does that get applied in the food chain? So once again, a grassland. I'll start with the simplest of the one to explain. Grassland. So this grassland, let's say, had 100 kcal. Okay. And let's say this grassland, for the sake of understanding, has only grasshoppers at trophic level. There are no other grazing animals. Now, what did it say? Energy can neither be transformed or created nor be destroyed, but can only be transferred or transformed from one form to another. Now the grasshopper is coming. Okay, so there is a grasshopper one. Let's say grasshopper one. This guy is jumping here. He's jumping. He's jumping. Now, before he even comes to the grassland, what has happened? He has expended energy E1 before he's even come to it. Okay, so this is for him to jump. He has not even touched the grassland. Then he eats the grasses. Okay. Now, for him to eat and digest, there is going to be some amount of energy. This is eating. Okay. Now, after he has eaten, some of it goes as waste product. That is E3. Then he jumps back and goes to a different place. That is E4. Now, are you able to understand that the 100 kilocalories that ideally we said no, it should have gone to the next trophic level. If you look at it, this 100 kilocal of grass has, forget E1 because it is not will not count that. E2 is for eating, E3 is for waste, E4 is for jumping back, and then some amount of energy goes and becomes this increase in body weight. Are you able to understand this? Now for the next trophic level, let's say grasshopper is going to be eaten by a frog. E2. Can the frog do anything about E2? It can't. That's an energy that's already gone. E3 waste. No, the frog is not concerned about the waste of the grasshopper. E4 jumping back. No. The only part that the frog is concerned is the body weight, which is anyway going to be a small percentage. And that small percentage is roughly 10%. In fact, it can be, later it was modified and it was mentioned that it can be anywhere between 10% to 35%. Are you able to understand why? A, because of Lenderman's rule, because you can blindly apply Lenderman's rule. But if you go even to the basics of the law of conservation of energy, you are able to see that the 100 kilocal that has gone into the mouth of the grasshopper gets dissipated in so many directions. And the only useful thing for the next tropical level is a tiny fragment of it called as the body weight. Is this clear, guys? Good. So now let's look at the slides. Ecological pyramid, it's a pyramid of numbers. Biomass, look at Lenderman's rule. Inverted pyramid, you have seen inverted pyramid. Oh, that's all. And we have, yeah, so somewhere here, though it's not mentioned in the slide, but I've mentioned how by applying the law of conservation of energy, you can also explain that there will always be losses. Okay, great. Now let's move on to this some more concepts. We are actually in a lot of concepts in today's class. Let's move on to some more concepts. Biotic interaction. It's a very short topic. In fact, only one slide on biotic interaction. Okay. So biotic interaction, what we'll do is we'll try to understand. We all know that environment has two components: biotic components and abiotic components. Okay. Now, biotic components can interact with abiotic components, do interact with abiotic components, because we do interact with air, we interact with water, we interact with sunlight, we interact with temperature. These are all the abiotic components of the environment. But within biotic organisms also we interact. Let's see how that interaction is classified. Okay. Now what I'm doing is I'm going to assign weights. Assign weights means we will call benefit as plus 1, no harm as 0, and harm as minus 1. Why we are saying this is, the result of any biotic interaction is only these three states. So this, what is this? This is the result. The result of biotic interaction. It is only 3. Now, 3 results, and how many species we are looking at? 2 species. Is this clear? 3 results, 2 species. Now, let's move on to the first case. The first case is that of mutualism, where the species 1, so this column is species 1, this column is species 2, this is an example. Species 1 all benefits and species 2 also benefits. So mutualism is synonymous to win-win situation for both. Both of them benefit. Are there such examples? There are multiple examples. I have given only few, but there are multiple examples. So one is the example of E. coli in large intestine, which inhibits the growth of other bacteria. So E. coli in the human intestine, it gets a space to stay, but it prevents other disease-causing bacteria from taking space in the human intestine. Cattle and egret. Have you heard of this? You must have seen a cattle and a bird is on top of it. Yeah. Now, how does the cattle get advantage? The egret many times it eats ticks. You understand ticks? Small insect kind of a thing that is there on the cattle's skin, on the hair. So the egret eat it. So the egret fills its stomach. The cattle gets rid of parasites which could otherwise be sucking its blood. So it's a win-win situation here. Shark and remora fish. So shark is a natural predator. So remora fish is one which attaches itself to the shark. So it's almost like shark gives remora fish a free ride wherever it goes. What does the remora fish do? Very similar to what egret does for cattle. It eats the parasite that is there in the shark. Okay. And also it eats the leftover from the shark, because shark is a prey. So it will eat big, let's say, fishes. Whatever is left out from the shark is eaten by the remora. And how does the shark benefit? The shark benefits because the parasites has been eaten by the shark. Sorry, by the remora. Pollination can also be seen as an example of mutualism. Why? From a flower point of view, or from the species of plant point of view, it helps in multiplying the population of that species. From a bee point of view, it is able to, bee or even birds, hummingbirds or any other birds, they get the nectar. So you have multiple examples of mutualism in nature. So that is +1 +1. Let's now look at commensalism. So one species is benefited, other has no impact. Other has no impact. Please bother. Here also, instead of shark remora, there is another species of fish. I'm forgetting, which is not attached to the shark, but it just goes along with the shark. There, it just gets benefited from the shark's leftover prey, pieces of the prey, but shark does not have any benefit. Anyway, so the other example of benefit is what is called as a dung beetles. So there are a specific type of beetles called dung beetles, and when the cow dung falls on them or when they go inside the dung, it provides food and shelter. The dung acts as the food as well as the shelter. Shelter because it provides the beetles the warmth. Yeah, a food is they are able to extract nutrients from the cow dung. But does it impact? Does it benefit the cow? No way. Does it harm the cow? No way either, because the cow is least bothered what happens to the cow dung. But for the dung beetles, it is a big thing. Okay, so that's on the commensalism. That's on the commensalism. Okay. Now the third one is amensalism. So the next score here is 0 + 1 is +1. I'm just saying this weightage for so that it's easy for you to remember. Because when you think of mutualism is +2 or commensalism is +1, you will for sure know that it has to be benefit and harm, no harm combination. It cannot be harm and no harm combination. Are you able to understand? Because that is how you'll get +1. The reason why I invented this weights was it is easy for you to remember. Commensalism means benefit, no impact, means what combination it is. It's easy for you to. Okay. Commensalism is +1 and no impact. Amensalism is -1 and no impact. So the next score is -1. Okay. One species is harmed and the other has no impact. One is harmed and the other has no impact. Now, shade of a large tree stunting the growth of a small tree. That's an example of amensalism. If you see in villages, generally, if you are raising tall trees on your land, the neighboring guy will object it. Especially if the sun direction is such that your tree's shadow will fall on his land, and in shadow plants do not grow really well, so he may object. So that's an example of amensalism. Okay. Now the fourth is competition. Competition means unfortunately both are harmed. So this is the lowest score. Two species compete for limited food in the same area. So in this, what happens? Because when it comes to wild animals, there is no concept of sharing. I mean, even in human beings, there is not really a concept of sharing among many beings. But in wild animals, for sure, there is no concept of sharing. So multiple, let's say, uh, uh, lion or tiger hunting one deer, there is always going to be a fight over who gets the, so to say, the lion's share of it. Yeah. So that's on competition. The last part is predation and parasitism. This we understand. So one is benefited and the other is harmed. So the score is 0. So the next score is 0. Are you kind of able to understand this kind of a weightage so that you're able to understand it? So if you can just remember, mutualism is +2. In fact, if we draw it over a line like this, something like this, draw it over a x-axis. This is 0, +1, +2, -1, -2. Okay, so -2 is your competition, where both are harmed. +2 is your mutualism, where where both are benefited. One is harmed and the other is benefited is predation or parasitism. So this becomes predation. Then commensalism is +1 and amensalism is -1. Okay, so that's an easy way to put commensalism and amensalism. Is this clear to you? Yeah, so that it also comes as I don't know, CARCM. You can remember the abbreviation. It's easy for you to. Okay, so that's biotic interaction. In short, we don't have anything more than this as far as biotic interaction is concerned. This is a big topic and also a useful topic to know, called as the biogeochemical cycle or the nutrient cycle. Okay, so let's first look at the heading. Nutrient cycle. So nutrient means what? What are all the nutrients that we know? We know for sure that nitrogen is a nutrient, phosphorus is a nutrient, carbon is a nutrient, water is also a nutrient, oxygen is a nutrient. So cycle. Cycle means it starts from somewhere and comes back to the same place. That is what we call as a cycle. So some circulation of these nutrients between something. What is that something? We will see. The second name is biogeochemical cycle. And we are saying both are same because we are using the word or. Both are same. Biogeo. So bio means biotic. Geo means abiotic. Now we understand. Okay, so the nutrient cycle is cycling between the biotic and the abiotic components of the ecosystem. So that way we get a very clear clarity. So just by looking at the name, we understand, oh, okay, so we are going to study about nutrient cycle consisting of so many nutrients. Yeah, we may not discuss all of them in equal importance, but okay, so many nutrients are there. And where are those nutrients circulating? They are circulating between the biotic and the abiotic components of the environment. Now, the biotic component of the environment is called as the cycling pool. The biotic component is called as the cycling pool. So this is your biotic component. abiotic component is called as the reservoir. Reservoir pool is one which has large amount of nutrients. So it could either be atmosphere or the Earth's crust. It could also be hydrosphere. Okay, so reservoir pool. So which means nutrients are getting cycled between the biotic and the abiotic components of the ecosystem. The biotic components of the ecosystem, anyway, they store small amounts of nutrients, whereas the abiotic part, they store large amounts of nutrients. Okay. Now, based on the type of reservoir, which is this, based on the type of reservoir, there are two types of nutrient cycle: gaseous cycle and sedimentary cycle. So, if the reservoir, the one which stores the nutrients, if it is atmosphere or hydrosphere, then the whole cycle is called gaseous cycle. If the reservoir is Earth's crust, then it's called as the sedimentary cycle. We will look at some of the cycles. Okay, there are more number of gaseous cycles, but we will look at the ones which are important. Okay, we'll start with the water cycle. We'll start with the water cycle, also known as the hydrological cycle or hydrological cycle. We all are quite aware of the water, but even before we go to the water cycle, it is very important for us to understand how much water do we have on Earth. In that, how much is the fresh water? So I found a very interesting graphic which I want to share with you here. It's taken from the World Bank website. World over, if you take the whole water that is present, that is in the entire hydrosphere, 97.5% is ocean water, salt water, and therefore not usable. Means when I say not usable is not drinkable. So how much is the fresh water? Fresh water is less than 3%. Less than 3%. Imagine, just less than. Now that 3%, I am excluding that into 100%. I hope you understand that. So this 3%, 80% of that 3% is in ice caps and glaciers. So ice caps and glaciers means poles and high range mountains. Poles and mountains. Which means 80% of this is 2.4. Let me make it simpler. Let me call this as so this is 3. So 80% of that 3% is 2.4. So let me call this as 2.5%. That 2.5% of this 3% is ice caps and glaciers. Means we generally don't use it. Then 20%, which is 20% of the 3%, which is like how much? 20% of the 3% is very close to 0.6%. But let me call this as a 0.5%. 0.5% is groundwater. Okay. Yeah, 0.6. So let me call it 0.5 because it adds up and makes it as 3. So this is 0.5%. Now there is a very small percentage which is neither ice cap nor groundwater. That is what we call as the surface water. This beautifully explains how short, how small amount of water are we able to really see on ground. That includes water on your lakes. It also includes soil moisture. Yeah, what we have in rivers is so amazing. It's only this much. Which means this one was 1%. Okay, so 1% of the 3%. 1% of the 3%. Yeah, 1% of the 3% is your surface water. Are you able to understand? 1% of the 3%. So it is something like 0.03% of the total water is surface water. But in this 0.03% water in river, so this is 3852, is already like 90, so it is less than 5%. So something like 5% of the 0.03% is there in the rivers. So now imagine Amazon, Nile, Yangtze, Sikyang, Ganga, Brahmaputra, all put together is 5% of the 0.3% of the total water that is on land. Now imagine all your conflict, Indus Water Treaty, the issue with Mahakali River with Nepal, Teesta River water, Brahmaputra issue, sometimes with China, sometimes with Bangladesh, Nile, Amazon, all put together is a very, very minuscule water. The reason why I have shown this graph is basically to drive home the point that how crucial it is for us to conserve the water that we have. Okay. The other way to look at it is, so this is one part, yeah, which means whatever surface water we have, we better conserve it properly, otherwise we will get lost. But there is another way to look at it. So this is only surface water. No, we are also causing an over exploitation of groundwater. This over exploitation is there. Because of global warming, this ice caps is getting merged into ocean. Do you agree? So on one hand, we have very little water. On the other, we are overusing the groundwater. On top of it, because of global warming, we are also making sure that the ice caps and glaciers which were supplying water to the river, yeah, now they are melting at a faster pace and they are eventually becoming part of ocean, creating potential water stress situations in the future. Is this clear, guys, at a high level? So this gives you a broad overview. Okay, ocean, fresh water, in that glaciers, groundwater, remaining is fresh surface water. In that surface water also, what is there in river is very, very, very small. Okay, and hence the importance of conservation, not just for the lakes, but also for the rivers. Okay, this is not water cycle, by the way. This is what I've just told you now is not water cycle, but I thought before we start water cycle, we understand the problem that we are up against. So water cycle, we all understand this, but let me quickly draw something and we can then move on to the next cycle. Let's say we have ocean. Okay, we have ocean, we have sun here, we have sun here. Then you have what you have evaporation. You have evaporation. So evaporation it goes, but when it reaches a height, it condenses into clouds. Some of these clouds move towards land base. So let me start writing this. The first thing that we are seeing is evaporation. Then as it goes high, because the temperature decreases with height, we all know that. The second phenomena that happens in water cycle is condensation. Okay. Now when the clouds reach the land, they are moisture laden and they are not able to carry it anymore. It results in the third phenomena, which is precipitation. This is precipitation. Okay. So let's say say that you have some trees over here. So it falls on the trees, it falls onto the ground, and once the water falls to the ground, it has two paths. One path is to go along the surface, another path is to sink into the surface. Sink to the surface. So when it sinks to the surface, this is called as 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay? When it sinks to the surface, it is called as percolation, and it eventually reaches the water table. And when it moves horizontally, it is called as surface runoff. It's called a surface runoff 5. And it's also interesting that the trees also exchange water, because the trees leaves have water and the leaves have opening called as stomata, and therefore through stomata when the water goes back to the atmosphere, it is called as transpiration. transpiration. So the transpiration is a phenomena where the stomata opens and it lets some water to escape into atmosphere. But transpiration also happens along with evaporation. So in that case, it is called evapotranspiration. Evapotranspiration. Yeah. Have I missed anything? So it starts with evaporation, condensation, precipitation, percolation, surface runoff, and transpiration. Yeah. So I think more or less this is covered. Yeah. So at a very high level, this is all your hydrological cycle is all about. So the water is evaporated either from the oceans or from the rivers. And are you able to see the cycle here? It's going to the clouds. It is coming down as precipitation. Some of it goes to the water table, but some of it through surface runoff goes to the river and comes back to the ocean. So that is why we call it a cycle. No? It all started with ocean and it ends in ocean. Broadly, this is all water cycle is all about. Yeah. So transpiration, you are clear no, about transpiration means when the stomata opens and lets the water in it to transpire. Now, if the top of the leaf is wet because of rain, if the top of the leaf or plant is wet because of rain, then even though it is above stomata, it evaporates. Correct? Because it is not inside the leaf, it is on the surface of the leaf. So it evaporates. So evaporation from the top of the plant and transpiration from within the plant, in this case, specifically from the leaf, together it is called evapotranspiration. Okay? Yeah. For all practical purpose, you can use the term evapotranspiration because it takes into account both the cases. So far, so good, guys. Okay. Now, in this, if you look at it, so this is a simple hydrological cycle. But what you need to write or what you need to be thinking, what they may also ask you in the examination, is what is man's impact on hydrological cycle? Man's impact on hydrological cycle. So if that's the case, what you will do, you will pretty much explain in a simple diagram like this as to what the normal hydrological cycle is. And then you can very well say what happens in the case of deforestation. Yeah. Now, if there is deforestation, let's say rampant deforestation without, let's say, compensatory afforestation, what is likely to happen? What happens to the transpiration? Transpiration is going to come down. I think someone raised your hand. Anyone has a question? Okay. So transpiration is going to come down. Is this clear? Now, what is going to happen to percolation? Can someone tell me what has happened to percolation? Increase or decrease? Okay, let's discuss it a bit faster. Percolation will reduce, absolutely. Percolation will reduce. What will happen to surface runoff? What will happen to the surface runoff? Surface runoff will increase because there is nothing to hold on to the water. No? Surface runoff will increase. Now, when percolation decreases for a long period of time, what happens to the water table? Increase, decrease. What happens to the water table? Water table will decrease. Yeah. Now, just one aspect of you cutting the tree has a very direct impact on the hydrological cycle. Yeah. Now, when the surface runoff increases, what is going to happen to the rivers? The rivers will start flooding. So you'll have so many other aspects which I'll discuss in detail in our deforestation and degradation and the sustainable development. But forest deforestation, we are seeing only the impact on water cycle. Similarly, if you see the impact on carbon cycle, oxygen cycle, you will find that it pretty much comes in all the cycles the moment you start deforestation. Okay, so this is a very simple diagrammatic explanation of what water cycle is all about and how human impact has changed the water cycle or has the capacity to change the water cycle. Okay, great. The next one is the carbon cycle. Just as water cycle, we'll now study carbon cycle. So carbon cycle is broadly of two types. One is called as the short carbon cycle, another is the long carbon cycle. Short carbon and long carbon. Right, one second. I have more space here. Yeah. So carbon cycle is so even though this is water cycle, but guys, what I am discussing now is carbon cycle. Okay. Carbon cycle. So the first what we are saying is the first one is called as a short carbon cycle. Short carbon cycle is what you have carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Then this carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is used by the plants. Am I right? It's used by the plant as part of photosynthesis. Then let's say the plants are eaten by the animals, and the animals do respiration. Is that correct? As part of respiration, they release back carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Very simple cycle. And that's why it's called as a short carbon cycle. And also the fact that respiration is happening every minute, no? Therefore, it's a short carbon cycle. Now let's come to the long carbon cycle. The long carbon. The long carbon cycle also, there are two different parts. Okay. Now the same thing. So you have carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The plants use them for photosynthesis. The animals eat the plant, and with time, both the plant and the animal, they will die and decay. Okay. Now, if the decay happens in a particular type of land called as marshy land, which is something like your wetland. If the decay happens in a marshy land, yeah, and it happens over and over again and again, means plants and animals have died, then the next cycle of plant and animal have died, which means over and over again, means in the marshy land there is a decay happening, and in between what is happening, time has passed. How much time has passed? A million years have passed. So million years have passed, and multiple layers of decayed plants and animals. Multiple layers, billion years and multiple layers of decay of plant and animal. So what does it cause? It causes high pressure and temperature. High pressure and temperature. So when you have plant and animal matter in a marshy area deposited on the earth's surface in multiple layers under high pressure and temperature, any idea what do you get at the end of it? What is the next block? Peatland, fossil fuels, exactly. Fossil fuels. We'll say fossil fuels. Yeah, I could even say fossil fuels, it will include everything, no? Petroleum, coal, everything. So the answer is fossil fuels. Fossil fuels. So this is your fossil fuel. But then the cycle is not yet completed. No? How will the cycle get completed? We should again come back to carbon dioxide. How will we come back to carbon dioxide? Here is where the great human beings come into picture. Yeah. The moment you burn fossil fuels, or this carbon cycle is burned. This carbon cycle is completed. Why is it called long carbon cycle? It is precisely because of this part. Okay, because it has taken billions of years. Any idea what if the fossil fuel, you continue to apply pressure and temperature and you do not burn? It doesn't happen all the time. It's a very, very approximate thing I'm saying. Instead of fossil fuel, let's say there is a graphite that is formed. Yeah, excellent, Prachit. Got the clue. You actually get diamond. So fossil fuel, further pressure and temperature, and couple of more millions of years. So further pressure and temperature. This is not required. You don't have to note down because I don't want to get confused. It's just a general knowledge question I asked. So this part you need not write. So fossil fuel with further pressure and temperature, it actually results in diamond. Yeah. So it's so beautiful, no? I tend to get philosophical when I see information like this because even in human, you say no that guy or girl or person is a gem of a person. Yeah, but the gem of a person did not just like that become gem of a person. He became or she became a gem of a person because of continuous tolerating or managing pressure and temperature and handling it with a poise. You understand what is the meaning of handling it with a poise? Handling it with a poise. What is poise? Doesn't matter. Even if you don't know, it's composure, composure, posture. Do you remember this? Yeah, so it is synonymous to that. It's paddling beneath the water, but overall it is looking very good. Okay. So this is long carbon cycle part A. Now let's look at long carbon cycle part B. Long carbon cycle part B. Long carbon cycle second. So in this, we look at how aquatic ecosystems or marine ecosystems take part in carbon cycle. So it all starts with carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So this remains the same. This time, instead of plant, we look at phytoplankton. We all know that phytoplankton is eaten by zooplankton. Now, the zooplankton is eaten by the fishes. Now, both the zooplankton and fishes, when they die, they settle at the, where do they settle? They settle at the bottom of the ocean. Bottom of ocean. Now, once they decay, what will be left once they decay? Any idea what will be left when the zooplankton and the fishes die and decay? Any idea? What will be there? What will be left? What is left when we human beings die? What is left? Yeah, bones. Absolutely. So the equivalent of bones in the case of the zooplankton and phytoplankton is their shell made up of calcium carbonate. You can write it down if you don't want to write the formula. Calcium carbonate. Now, this calcium carbonate can get deposited based on which depth that animal was. So, this calcium carbonate could be in the continental shelf. Yeah, it could be in the continental slope. It could be anywhere. It could be in the abyssal plain. It could be anywhere. Okay. Now, any idea how do we complete the carbon cycle here? There, human beings came and we, used the fossil fuels and directly emission and CO2. In this case, suppose human beings are not there. Corals, good guess. Corals are there. Okay, so it's actually good answer. I had not thought about it, but that's right. That's a good answer. So what eventually happens in this case, human beings are not there. Is how should I call this? Let me call this as maybe plate tectonics. So because of plate tectonics, can someone tell me what is going to be the next block because of plate tectonics? Yeah, they use a thing, but how is the carbon dioxide going to get released back to the atmosphere? So the clue is plate tectonics. So the moment plate tectonic is there, the sea floor is going to rise. The sea floor is going to rise. So now the sea is going to, I should say, should get exposed above surface of water. The moment it is exposed above surface of water, what happens? The agents like water, rainfall, all of it will eventually help it in eventually help in the release of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Okay. Yeah. So volcano does release carbon dioxide. You are right, but the general contribution of volcano that we will discuss is more for sulfur dioxide. But volcano does release carbon dioxide also. So technically, that's also true. That's also true. Okay. So that completes our cycle on carbon cycle. Okay. Yeah, island arc. Once it becomes an island arc, then it is exposed to air and the calcium carbonate, water. I think you guys know better chemistry than me. Calcium carbonate, water, eventually carbon dioxide will get released, yeah, in one form or the other. So that's your long carbon cycle. So this is the second carbon cycle. Nitrogen is a little. I thought let me spend some time, but nitrogen is a little complicated. Oxygen cycle. Let's do oxygen cycle, and we can then close today's class. Oxygen cycle. The figure is self-explanatory. If you look at it, so you have oxygen. Oxygen is used by plant. So oxygen is used by plant for respiration. Oxygen is used by plant for respiration. Then the same oxygen along with fossil fuel. So industry, imagine they are burning coal. What do? The industry takes oxygen from the atmosphere and takes fossil fuel. So it produces carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide is once again used by the plant to give back oxygen. Yeah. And similarly, the animal eats the plant. Animal respiration, for respiration, it takes oxygen and leaves carbon dioxide, which is once again used by the plant. So I thought this one picture is kind of self-explanatory about oxygen cycle. And oxygen cycle is relatively simple. Yeah, as you can see, it is ultimately about three parts. One is the autotrophs, one is the herbivore and also carnivore, and third is the contribution of man. So man, autotrophs, and herbivores. All of this put together eventually help you in understanding the carbon cycle. So far, nitrogen I will discuss, but so far, the nitrogen, carbon, oxygen, water, they all had reservoirs as what? Reservoirs as atmosphere or water. But sometimes the Earth's crust can also be a reservoir. The Earth's crust. Yeah, that is why you remember we talked of two types of cycles, gaseous cycle and sedimentary cycle. Okay, so now we talk about sedimentary cycle. Sedimentary cycle, there are only two major sedimentary cycles, phosphorus cycle and sulfur cycle. So phosphorus cycle, the Earth's crust contains phosphorus in the form of phosphates. You must have studied, in India physical geography or mineral resources. You can find out where all mineral resources are there in India, and whenever it is phosphorus, it is always phosphates. But we all also know that if the rock is there because of be it desert or even in other conditions, because of continuous temperature from the sun and cool time or cool weather or weather during the night time, there is weathering. Yeah. So first is weathering. All these rocks, they will experience weathering. Now, once they are small enough, what happens? They are easily carried by the agents of erosion. So from erosion, so from their place, they are carried by agents of erosion. So from there, maybe they enter the river. From the river, they enter ocean. And from the ocean, they are generally present in the continental shelf. Yeah, simple. So you had phosphate on the earth crust. Had phosphate on the earth crust. Then there is weathering. Then erosion, river, ocean, continental shelf, and if there is a tectonic shift, what happens to the continental shelf? It rises above. Once it rises above, then it becomes a phosphate rock itself, which is again subjected to weathering, erosion. The same process. Okay, so this is your simple phosphorus cycle. Now, the problem with once again man's intervention into the phosphorus cycle is that the natural process of weathering. So earlier there was only weathering. Now weathering, along with weathering, there is a much more impactful process called as mining. Please remember, if there is one cycle which is most impacted by mining, it is phosphorus cycle. Yeah, this is something because you can imagine, no, weathering would have taken tens of thousands of years to break a rock, but mining means several tons of rocks is broken just like that. And after this, everything remains the same: erosion, river, ocean, and all. Okay, so you are creating an artificial imbalance. So that's your sedimentary cycle. And phosphorus cycle, as you have seen, it starts with phosphate. So you can just write here on the Earth's crust. Phosphate where? Phosphate on the Earth's crust. So this shelf is continental shelf. Continental shelf, because of tectonics, plate tectonics, some parts may rise. The one that rise, they become the new Earth's crust. They are subject to weathering again. The last one is sulfur cycle. Nitrogen I will discuss in the next class. Sulfur cycle. Just as phosphorus exists as phosphates in rocks, sulfur exists as sulfates in rocks. Okay, it exists as sulfur in rocks. Now, sulfur cycle is a little complicated than phosphorus cycle. In fact, it is the only cycle. Yeah, I think this you should remember. It is the only cycle which is both sedimentary as well as gaseous. This is the only cycle. Sedimentary because we talked about sulfates. Gaseous because in the process, the whole sulfur cycle, gases like hydrogen sulfide and sulfur oxides are released. Gases like hydrogen sulfide and sulfur oxides are released. Now, so this sulfates, yeah, sometimes they combine with the existing decaying material and they get inside coal. When this coal is burnt, along with carbon dioxide, sulfur oxide also gets released. That is why this is one cycle where you are starting with the sedimentary rock, you're starting with the sulfates in the rock, which is a sedimentary kind of cycle, but you also have gaseous. So this is the only cycle which has the distinction of having both gaseous as well as sedimentary aspect. So there are natural ways also through which sulfur dioxide is released, as I have mentioned earlier in the class. Volcanic eruptions are another examples where sulfur dioxide can be released. Okay, so this brings us to the end of today's class. We have about maybe 45 minutes of basics of environment, and after that we will take up the last remaining topic, which is sustainable development.